Hi everyone, my name is Stawski and I'm a UI engineer at Splunk. My talk is about tracing, and I truly believe that tracing is for everyone. And I will explain you how to trace user events with GraphQL and OpenTelemetry. So you're probably asking, what a UI engineer is doing at KubeCon, and what does UI have to do with tracing? Well, anything happens with your product. UI is the first thing that the customers see. UI is the first thing that fails. And the customers are always complaining that this button is not working, this page is not working, this tab is not working. So UI is always blamed first, no matter what happens. If things are not completely failing, but they are a little bit slow, for example, it's also really hard to track, especially to figure out whether it's a UI or something in the backend, something with the microservices. So having some tools that help you do that is really useful. Of course, we have front-end analytics. The most popular is Google Analytics, but sometimes it's not enough. You have to go dig into logs. You have to go look at microservices. You have to sometimes write custom JavaScript snippets just for you to figure out where the issue is happening. And while UI is struggling with trying to figure out what happens and where the issues are, backend engineers already have really good tools at their disposal, and ops also have been looking forever at logs, at different services that help you figure out where the issue is. But for UI, well, you do a console log, you look at your Google Analytics, you look at your inspector to see the performance, but it's all a little bit disconnected. And finally, the products are getting more complex, and Frontend is not just a service anymore. Frontend can be broken into different microservices built with different languages, and it's much harder to debug issues if you have multiple different languages within your front-end application. Maybe they are stitched together and something is slow, but you don't know what. And yes, we love microservices. So how can we make it work better? How can we trace it better? And so this is an example of a stack that I use at my daily life. We have an application that is basically stitched from Angular and React. And we use GraphQL and Apollo libraries to make sure GraphQL seamlessly works both in Angular and React and in the backend. And another tool that we use is this amazing project called OpenTelemetry. It's fairly new. It's only, so it's in beta now. It's only about a year old, slightly more than that. And I got to tell you a little bit about it before I go in a little bit more into how to use it. So OpenTelemetry is a combination of two projects that existed before, OpenTracing and OpenCensus. And together, they provide a set of tools that are uniform, that are provided in one place, that let you collect your traces and metrics about your application. Again, it's usually used in the backend. And a good thing, there is also a project called OpenTelemetry.js. So I was, some time ago, I was really excited to find out that there is already a library that lets you use it. It's mostly geared towards Node users, but you can also use it in the browser. So far, it's been kind of disjointed, so you can use it in your UI, and then you can use it in your backend, but correlating the traces is a little bit of a pain. Still, it's very exciting. Right. And two big areas where OpenTelemetry gives you tools are traces and metrics. And traces is a series of events that relate together that represent an end-to-end event flow through a distributed system. And you can also apply it to the UI in some way. So for backend, it's usually a request flow through multiple microservices. This might be your request that goes from your UI, and you're requesting a user info going through a middleware that queries another service, that queries a database, and the whole thing end-to-end is a trace. But again, you could also speculate that for UI, you can create traces that are a little bit bigger than that. And finally, metrics is a numeric representation of data measured over intervals of time. For example, a number of requests per minute. And so in a traditional approach, UI is just one microservice. Here it is, but UI is just much more than just a service. You can have a lot of user actions that happen. Users can go through the page for a long time before they actually click something that triggers a backend. And it's very good to be able to track that. Users do a lot on the modern application pages. There might be not just one, but multiple backend calls. And as I already mentioned, performance issues are really hard to track, especially with multiple UIs, multiple backend calls. And to be able to identify where the issue is, so far, UI engineers had the same tools at their disposal as backend and ops 5-10 years ago, right? You go to the logs, you try to figure out what is going on. And so how are we trying to solve this problem right now? Again, OpenTelemetry help. And so how are we trying to solve this problem right now? Well, OpenTelemetry helps not just backend engineers and ops and data scientists. It helps UI engineers. So let's switch to our sample application that I'm building to be able to correlate some traces from UI and the backend. And to simplify it a little bit, I want to use both Angular and React. I will just use React. I will use GraphQL and Apollo libraries to simplify things a little bit, and OpenTelemetry. In our application, we'll have a UI with some actions. Something would happen in the UI. And we will capture these actions using the browser. Then we will send these actions to the GraphQL backend, where we will basically look at the spans and we record this information and we send it after that to the Zipkin collector. And we'll collect traces in Zipkin. And if you want to follow along or do it at your own time, here is a link to the repo. It will also be there at the end of the slides. So feel free to go ahead and take a look. All right, into the wild. Let me share my screen now. I have and in that repo that I just shared, I have two applications that we'll go through. So let me start my terminal. And there are two parts in that repo. There is a front-end application that's built in React, and there is a back-end application. So for front-end, it's a React and TypeScript, and I have this useTelemetry hook that I built that's going to be posting traces into two places, actually. One is we want these traces to end up in Zipkin, to be able to see them there. And another one is we'll be exporting the traces into the backend when to be able to do something with them in the backend. And then finally, I have my backend application. Is just JavaScript, single page, that's gonna basically that's running a Polo server, a GraphQL server, and on a new request, it would actually retrieve my spans that I'm sending using headers. So there is a special header called GraphQL current spans, and you can see in my application, that's GraphQL, that I'm going to send GraphQL current spans to the backend. And so on every query that comes to the backend, I will retrieve these through headers, and I will create span with span attributes that contain trace ID and a parent ID. So we will post them to Zipkin as well. So we would be able to correlate those. So now let's start my applications. Let's start backend first. All right, it should be ready. Let's check it. And I won't be, actually, yeah, let's check if it works. Yes, we have our GraphQL there. There will be no traces because we're not sending anything from a frontend. And then we're in start. Now we're gonna start our UI application. And as you can see, it's a simple one. There's just a number of buttons, and there is a button that will send some request to the backend, and the button and parent span will just wrap up all spans in the UI and will not send anything to the backend. So here we are trying to capture user actions, and of course it doesn't have to be button clicks. It can be anything, but let's try that here. So I clicked for buttons, and I clicked my get finished spans. So actually my backend should have received the spans, and my UI should have sent the spans too. Okay, so we got our spans in the backend. Let's take a look. All right. In tags, here is the traces and parent IDs that are propagated from the UI. But let's go and see if we got our UI traces. Oh, it doesn't always work as expected, but let's see. Okay, let me start the UI. All right. Actually, to be able to post any traces from the UI, I need my course enabled. This is what I think didn't work for the first time. So let's try again. I'm clicking a few buttons and doing get finished spans. So now we actually got these 3 spans from a UI. Let's look at them. All right. We got our button IDs, so we can provide metadata. There is a trace ID and a span ID here. Same in here. Okay, so let's go back and click again. So this happened less than a minute ago, and this is corresponding backend traces. That actually has a parent ID and a trace ID. So let's take a look at the parent ID. So let me write it down somewhere. So 600. It's basically just create a new place to put my ID. And go back and look at my UI traces. Okay. And you can see that they are identical. So we can connect this data, and we can basically correlate the UI and the backend. So let's go back from screen share to the slides. And again, you can take a look at the GitHub repo. It's a little bit more comprehensive than what I showed right now. And you can basically share this information with multiple different ways. So what I did is I assigned tags to my spans that's with parent ID, and I provided this parent ID in my backend that I picked up from my spans sent from the UI. You can create more tags. You can send in actions, so you can do a lot more with this information. So yeah, what we can do, we can track user actions, and we can go through maybe different user scenarios that we're looking into. So in the UI, it's easy to, so basically if you're you have some flows in the UI that users need to follow, and you want to connect them to the backend at certain points, you could provide these spans and store them, and it will be a lot more detailed than just having this UI item on your list of traces. Then you can also track these actions and track backend requests together and provide this information and have backend and the UI be a part of the same trace. You can basically time what's going on in the UI in your UI. So in Zipkin, we saw that there is some timing already available for the spans, and it will help with performance, especially if you have multiple front ends. And finally, if anything caused an error, you can look not just at multiple different services, not just multiple logs. You don't have to solely try to look into Chrome Inspector and try to figure out what backends are working and what doesn't work for you. You can export these traces into one of the multiple solutions that's available now on the market, and basically just visually see where issues are happening and how they are impacting your user experience. So it's not just the UI now, and of course this is a limited set of libraries. This is the UI with OpenTelemetry that gives you so many more possibilities than before. So that's it. Thank you very much. There is more details in the GitHub repos. This is a short link, or you can go through, it's github.com, Nina Stawski, OpenTelemetry GraphQL. And this is how you can contact me. Thank you for your attention, and I want to open the floor for... All right. Hi, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the talk. I can see there are a few questions already, and there is one I'll answer right now, and then I'll look at the other ones. So someone's asking, what is a span? Well, you can think of a span as a unit of work that has some data attached to it. So let's say we have built a website that has a book catalog, and we're searching for a book or something. So retrieving book info from this catalog, from the UI, kind of the information about this action would be your trace. But your request on the way of retrieving this info might go through multiple different services, right? The UI sends an API call to your backend. It might need to authenticate. It might need to call a service that will actually return you this book info. The service in turn will call the database to get info about the books, and so kind of it takes a few hops on the way. So each of these hops is a span, and each of these spans might have some information attached to it. So how long did the operation take? How what else happened? So maybe name of a service, anything actually. You can actually also add these tags manually, as you saw we did with when we posted traces to Zipkin from a backend. We added some more info. So this hops on the way is a span, and the whole thing is a trace. Right, let me take a look. All right, so let me share if people are asking about the repo. Let me move to the last slide. So there is a short link and a long link. Both backend and frontend are in the same repo, so you can use that. Okay. So one more question. Oh, let me actually make sure I have too many questions going in. All right, let's start from the top. To use the same trace ID for the, so Kevin Liu is asking, to use the same trace ID for the UI spans and backend server spans, wouldn't it be better for the UI to publish its own spans instead of sending them via their request header, instead having the UI propagate the trace context to the backend server? This is a good question. This is actually what we attempted to do in this combination of front-end and backend. As you saw, I was posting my traces from the UI, and I was also sending them as headers to the backend, and I used those to basically tag with the trace ID, tag my traces that I post from the backend. The challenge with the UI is, of course, you need to, when I run it on the local, I run a course plugin, and I'm just posting my traces. But you need to authenticate. You need to make sure it is secure. It's harder to do from the browser. You can still absolutely do that, but it will require a bit more work. All right. One more question. So, okay. Hamish Robertson, hopefully I'm reading your name right, is asking, you have to manually correlate the UI actions in the backend traces. Well, we were doing that manually, of course, but you can do some automation on top of that. So if you use the same tags on the UI traces and the backend traces, there are solutions out there that let you basically filter by these tags and see these traces together. So you don't have to do it manually every time. But again, in this small test repo, we were doing it manually, of course. All right. Nicola Bianchi is asking whether OpenTelemetry is sets of libraries or just a standard. It is. It is actually both. It's a standard, and it's also a set of libraries for different languages that are implementing the standard. And if you go to GitHub/OpenTelemetry, you can learn more about that. Yeah. One more thing I wanted to say about that, it's actually, OpenTelemetry is pretty exciting. It's open source, and any contributions matter. So even if you've been thinking, oh, maybe I want to do something for an open source project, or maybe you're just interested in tracing, take a look at OpenTelemetry, and any contribution, even docs, anything, it matters. It helps grow the project. It helps take it forward. It helps make it more useful for people. So contribute. All right. Danielle Minella is asking, how can I extract this data from tracing to a more dashboard-oriented information? Well, there is a lot of different solutions out there that let you basically, as you collect your data, visualize it in a more comprehensive way than just in Zipkin. well, I'm from Splunk, so we have our own OpenTelemetry implementation that shows you pretty comprehensive dashboards and lets you identify issues within your system pretty quickly. And well, there's other solutions out there, but of course, I'm from Splunk, so take a look at Splunk on microservices APM. All right. In the real world, so Vignesh Rajasekaran, hopefully I'm pronouncing your name right, is asking, in a real world application, how do you pick which requests to trace, since monitoring everything might not be performant and not always necessary? That's true, and it would depend on each individual application and each situation, kind of. Well, yeah, the true answer, it depends. It depends on, of course, it is also somewhat similar to what you would trace with Google Analytics, maybe, right? You can specify some certain user scenarios that are important for you, and then you can attempt to trace those. Maybe look at it from a point of view, okay, what would I track? What user scenarios, what user actions would I track with Google Analytics? And then kind of apply it to what you track, what you trace with OpenTelemetry. It's very individual. I just, yeah, it's hard to say. All right. Funny question. Srinivas Coimbatore says, asks, what is the difference between front-end and back-end? So I'm calling front-end basically the UI side, your application that user interacts with, and I'm using back-end as a basically collective description of all the services, or microservices or services that are behind that this UI is contacting, or like this big blob behind it. And your UI not necessarily contacting all the backend services, right? As in an example, as I explained earlier, with the book catalog, your UI would talk to the authentication service. It would talk to some backend servers that will return you a book info, and then this backend service in turn also can contact the database. So kind of you have this, and it's a simplistic view of a UI engineer by having basically front end separately and a back end as this blob of info. All right. Andre Stroud is asking, in our own environment, we generate our own correlation ID at the edge. And then we pass it to downstream services. Oh, jumped. 1 second. To downstream services, for the time being, we use this to correlate logs across multiple microservices. Is it possible to use a correlation ID as the trace ID? As far as I saw in OpenTelemetry JS, you can provide your trace ID. So when you create a span, you can provide some metadata about that. And one of the items that it can inherit is a trace ID. But for that, you need to send a span that already exists. If you don't have a span, your only option for the trace ID is sending it as a tag, at least so far. Well, again, it's an open standard. It's open source. If it doesn't work for you, feel free to contribute and suggest the updates. But basically, in your case, what you could do is you could send your correlation ID as a span tag, or if you already have your spans with a correlation ID as a trace ID, I assume you don't. But if you did, you could provide this span as a parent span for all the spans that you are creating, and it would inherit them automatically. All right, Vincent Desbois, again, hopefully I'm reading your last name right, asking whether GraphQL backend already pre-integrated to OpenTelemetry or did I have to instrument it myself? So in this case, I did instrument it myself, but so there is two ways you can talk to your GraphQL backend, right? You can you can establish a WebSocket connection, or you can basically send HTTP requests. And for HTTP requests, there is already a plugin for OpenTelemetry.js, so it can be instrumented automatically. For WebSocket, there is no plugin yet, but it's in development. So hopefully soon you will be able to use that. For this example that you saw in the talk, it was all manual instrumentation. So I basically just did it manually. All right. Piyush Badaria is asking, are there any performance impacts that you might be aware for OpenTelemetry Java instrumentation? I'm not familiar with OpenTelemetry Java instrumentation. If you meant to ask about JavaScript, of course, if you're collecting your traces in the UI side, and especially if you're posting it into Zipkin or somewhere else, it will impact your performance somewhat. So there is always a trade-off. But there is always a trade-off. So it is kind of preferable for now to post your traces from the backend, and that's why kind of also part of the stock happened because, well, as you saw, I'm basically just sending my traces through headers to the backend, and then backend has a lot more resources to connect and collect these traces and post these traces. All right. Let's see. I do not see any more questions. So if you have some, you can post them here, or I will also be in Slack in the Cloud Native Computing Foundation Slack at the channel to KubeCon Observability, and you can message me directly. So I'm happy to answer any further questions. Thank you, everyone.